I'm just really pleased to have this opportunity to share my experience in attending the National United Church of Christ Biennial Synod in Kansas City this summer. I learned that the word synod is an assembly of the clergy, that is, the pastors and laity, and the laity is the rest of us, in a division of a particular church. The other thing I learned is that Kansas City, at least the Kansas City people talk about, is in Missouri. When I had cause to mention my misunderstanding, KC people laughed because they're used to this reaction, and I had given them one more instance to tell to their friends. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to experience this. I had blessings throughout the time I was there. At the airport, I was not sure how to get to the hotel. Someone suggested a taxi since I did not have an Uber app on my phone and I didn't want to deal with it since I'd never done that. I went to an empty taxi stand to wait, and you had to walk the furthest way out from the doors, in heat, of course, to get there, but I did, and there was no one else there, but another woman joined me, and we learned we were staying at the same hotel, and we decided to share the cab. The fare came to $40 plus a tip. She paid it and said, when I started to reach my purse, she said, "Oh, don't worry about it." She worked for the UCC, so her costs were being reimbursed. What a great start. After checking in at the hotel, I walked a long block to the convention center to pick up my registration materials. So I put the name tag on right away, and this is the name tag. And I was surprised to see it only had my name and then a line where I should write in my personal pronoun, she. And I thought, usually name tags give more information, like where people are from and so on. But I found this to be very good because I could start a conversation with anybody wearing that name tag, as they did with me. "Oh, where are you from? And what's your role in your church? And have you ever been here before?" And I later found an opportunity to put on this ribbon, which says, "This is my first General Synod." And one man took pride in telling me it was his 32nd. They only happen every other year, so I was trying to figure out how old he was. I decided he was old. And then the other ribbon I picked up later, too, says Committee on Ministry. I serve on a Committee on Ministry right here in Northern California, the one that helps people who want to become authorized ministers in the United Church of Christ become authorized ministers. So anyway, that also opened, conversation with other people. And so right away, I was in a community. I walked back to the hotel, and I had the tag on, and I sat at the restaurant there. And someone else came in with the tag and said, "Would you mind if I joined you?" And so someone joined me at dinner, and I joined someone else at breakfast the next morning, just because we were wearing our tags. At the vendor tables, I picked up these couple of ribbons, and as I said, those were great conversation starters, too. I was immediately a part of a community and felt included wherever I went. That said, I knew many people there, and sometimes I was with people I knew, and other times not, and it didn't seem to matter. My biggest personal joy was seeing Reverend Meredith Jackson, whose parents, Drew and Mary, were longtime members of this church, and as far as I know, Meredith is the only person who entered the ministry, at least for a good many years, out of this church. She immediately found a job in St. Louis, Missouri, and went there, and she no longer works for that particular church. She works for an organization called Isaiah Ministries, and it's a nonprofit that does a lot of good work in the community. She was there with her 2-year-old twins, they just turned 2, and her husband. There was a children's enclosure where they played, but you know how it is. 2-year-olds need you a lot, and 2 need even more. The theme of the synod was Into the Deep, Luke 5:4, as you can see from the bulletin logo. Hannah just read the scripture, which gives us the setting for the deep. I had anticipated we'd be talking about deep water, but in a sermon by our UCC president, the very impressive Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, speaks of the deep as, and I quote, a goal and aspiration, a place to anchor our hopes and live more fully into our commitments to being followers of Jesus. The disciples had already fished in the lake without catching anything, but Jesus sent them back to try again in the deep water looking for more. And we know they found more. And this is what we are being asked to do. Look again, find more, study issues more deeply, and become closer to God, end quote. A part of the setting in our worship and work is shown in the pictures at the back of the bulletin. They are pieces of a very long stage scenery, and now in my notes I said as long as this sanctuary, but I think even longer actually. And I'm going to just point out some things. In that first photo on the upper left, we see not only the prairie grass, but we see their deep roots, and they represent the prairie land where we were meeting right in the middle of the country. In a future service, an Indian man and a boy pulled out small bunches of the grass and braided them and laid the braids on a small wooden cart. This was a tradition begun by their ancestors, and it is described in the book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where the words from our call to worship came from. Braiding sweetgrass, indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plants. And I have my copy along, which I'll just leave out later, and you can take a look if you'd like to see it. The quotations from it were used during the services. In the same photo, you can see a transparent lectern in the blue and red on the left side. And they became visible only when someone was speaking. Otherwise, they were in the background. The photo on the right gives a better view of the speaker's lectern and also shows how the scenery continues down to the main floor. It gives us a glimpse of some people working in the background. On the far right, you can see some heads, and those were the moderator, the parliamentarian, among others. And beyond them, an area that doesn't show in this picture, where we have a keyboard player who was actually playing many times throughout, but then seats for the band also, who were part of the worship services. We only notice these people when they are performing or speaking. Otherwise, we're just looking at the rich scenery. And let me say here that other than the backdrop, most of what we see is real. Real dirt with living plants, grasses, flowers, and other, I think there was even a real tree, things, genuine stones and large rocks of various sizes, real water, and real animal statuary, just as we see in the third photo and in our own yards. It would have been hard to have the real animals there, of course. We met in that hall for worship services and for plenary sessions, and the plenary sessions are the business meetings where, among other things, or the main things actually, were the 11 resolutions that were discussed and voted by the 745 delegates. There were over 1,800 people there, by the way. Spoiler alert, all the resolutions passed, some with more discussion than others. It would be tedious to go through all of them, but there are 5 I'd like to highlight. 2 of them were for full funding to be restored to agencies that I think are dear to many of our hearts, one being the Voice of America, and the other being the United States Agency for International Development, often known as USAID. And these have had funding removed and people removed. As we know, they've lost their jobs. And they have done good work worldwide. And so this was a plea for that, or not a plea, a resolution that will go further to have that restored. They've been in the news, as I said, and I thought you'd like to know that the UCC, along with many other churches and advocacy groups, are working on these. There were several resolutions of witness. One stood out to me in particular because I didn't know of this situation in India, and because of what came with the committee hearing on it. Every delegate is assigned to a committee to study a particular resolution. And it's their job to work with the wording and come up with something that can be presented on the floor for the vote. And I dropped in on 2 of these sessions, 2 different ones, and in both sessions, somebody reminded everyone that they did not have to come up with a resolution that they would personally vote for. They just had to come up with one that seemed fair to present to the whole community. As I listened to those, they had several sessions, and by the last one, people were getting really nitpicky, you know, and when they started talking about punctuation, you know, semicolons versus commas, I was glad I wasn't delegate because I could leave, and I did. But the resolution that I'm talking about is to urge the United States government to name India a country of particular concern for egregious violations of religious freedom. So each of the delegations had people who had expertise in the resolution come and share with the committees. And so this was true of this one too. 2 men represented the persecuted Christian and other minority communities from India traveled here to speak. Their identities were never revealed. There were no pictures taken, and at every single meeting of this resolution, all the copies of the resolution were collected back. You could have your name on yours and get the same one back at the next meeting to prevent distribution. Such was the danger of having the Indian government identify them with this work. There are 2 more I'd like you to know about, which are close to the heart of our community. One is a resolution responding to the federal government's attack on immigrants, migrants, and refugees, and we certainly have that concern, and a resolution calling on the United Church of Christ to oppose the 2025 immigration rollbacks, support immigrants, refugees, and Pacific Island communities while amplifying anti-racist work on behalf of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color in response to the current socio-political backlash. And that certainly has deep meaning for us here too. But you can see from that title why I'm not reading you all the titles of all the resolutions. I hope you can see that these kinds of issues are what the greater UCC was working on. At the first meeting, first business meeting, a woman named Reverend Shari Presteman spoke. Both formally and informally, she was introduced to us as a candidate for a new Associate Minister of Global Missions. And in fact, she's been serving in that capacity, but she couldn't fully come into it, be voted into it until there was a synod. And she was introduced, and her background was so impressive. She's been acting in that role for 1.5 years. She was elected to serve it at this synod, and I, among many others, felt we were meeting a hero. For instance, she partnered with Global Hope when Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast 20 years ago. She has led study trips to Palestine and Israel, and has journeyed with the global ministries delegations in Haiti, Colombia, Germany, Indonesia, and East Timor. You can see why she's an excellent candidate for missions worldwide. When we've donated to these crises over the years, Sherry was one of the people who were determining where our funds could be most effectively used. I attended a meet and greet for Sherry because it was a pleasure to hear her speak and respond to people's questions. And a Samoan man from our conference, someone I actually know, said to her, "I want to tell you that for the Pacific Islanders, you are the face of the UCC." And I thought that was very telling about her work. Presteman says, "I have personally witnessed the life-giving, life-changing power of our ministries in so many places and ways. What we do together as a church makes God's love real in the world and has tremendous, inspiring impact. I feel incredibly blessed to be in a position where I can nurture and strengthen this amazing work." I'm sure it won't surprise you to learn she was resoundingly voted in for this position the next day. Yeah. Then there were several workshops, and I couldn't choose. There were so many, and you want to attend one but not miss another, and so I actually poked my head in and out of several doorways just before to see what the presenters were doing to get ready. And I went to the one about UCC's Media Justice Ministry, and I'm glad that I did. Their work dates back more than 60 years ago to a time many of us will actually remember. It was during the civil rights protests. And according to one of our speakers, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked the UCC to file a case against the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, challenging the broadcasting licenses of TV stations that did not represent all the people in their community. The man King spoke with was Everett Parker, the founder of this UCC ministry, who was inspired by King's descriptions, especially of the TV station WLBT in Jackson, Mississippi. It had a KKK bookstore on the property, and it blatantly discriminated against blacks. It was an NBC outlet and the most powerful station in the Mid-South. And Parker decided that the UCC should do something. They collected information documenting the lack of blacks shown on the WLBT programming, and the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, dismissed their complaints. But the UCC Office of Communications sued, and it took 20 years, working way through the courts and waiting for the next hearing and so forth, that the court ruled that the public has standing in FCC proceedings, that stations operate in the public interest, and that all sectors of the public must be served. WLBT's license was vacated, and an African-American ownership took over. This landmark decision that the public, from the UCC's lawsuit, that the public has standing in FCC proceedings, has been the basis for such cases ever since. Every DC lawyer and lobbyist is familiar with it, and the work of the UCC in achieving it. Our speaker said she works in DC on these kinds of issues, and her name tag, of course, includes the words United Church of Christ, and she's sometimes asked if it's a real church. Small but mighty. From then on, the UCC Office of Communication became a watchdog agency, challenging discrimination and working to achieve equal opportunity employment rules in broadcasting. They're currently focusing on affordable internet, public media funding, and phone justice. I'm going to talk a little bit about phone justice to give you an idea. It's an important issue for people who are incarcerated. The charges to make phone calls are outrageous. And this is prisons, jails, federal, all along the line. And as families spend money on this, many of them are, of course, impoverished, and they are, taking that money away from other things the household needs, like maybe food and, other kinds of things, just to keep in touch. The tragic part of this is that a national law with reasonable rates was passed and signed by President Biden in 2022. But the current administration stopped enforcing it, so the costs have risen again, and it is being fought again. So the speaker explained to us that the Office of Media Justice has to build their cases. They, she said, must find people who have skin in the game, people who have had personal experience of this, often relatives of the incarcerated folks, and who will respond to the call to witness and are willing to fill out and sign a declaration about their experience. The presenter stated, "We cannot do this work without you," meaning us. I now subscribe to their newsletter, where a recent issue had this to say about the phone cost-related lawsuit they filed. UCC and others in the Christian community have long pressed for lower caps on communication to fulfill the biblical mandate in Matthew 25 to visit and care for people in prison. Advocates note that lower costs keep families intact and improve the success rate for people once they rejoin their communities. I think that makes sense to us. Before I went to Synod a couple of times, I announced the Banned Books Project. At the conference, I learned that most books aren't banned from the public for a state or even a region. More often, they're banned from public and school libraries in a community, usually based on parents' objections. This project took requests from several churches who would like to have the books available to their members without the members having to go out and buy them. A notable example that is not so, it happens, but the book is not so current, to me was a shock. It was Charlotte's Web. How many of you read Charlotte's Web? Yeah. Yourself or to your children or both or whatever. And I looked at, and that's in Kansas, in several areas in Kansas. And I looked it up. I couldn't imagine what it was that people objected to. Well, they object to two things. One, that there's a death in the book. Charlotte the spider dies. And that puzzles me. I mean, it is very sad if you've read the book. And I know in my house we started saving spiders after we read it to my daughter. But, you know, still, that's what happens to spiders. But the other one was that the animals talk, which they thought would be confusing to their children. Yeah. So anyway, the churches request titles and let the communities know that they can be borrowed from that church. As the first worship service was beginning, a line of wagons with boxes of banned books addressed to the requesting churches was pulled through the worship area, and people applauded and cheered. I could say so much more, and I actually wrote thousands of words to explain some of the situations, and then went back, and you'll be happy to know I cut extensively. As interesting as I think they are, 4 days of activities cannot be effectively condensed into a 15 to 20-minute talk. I was not a delegate, as I have said, despite having volunteered for the past 3 synods, so that's 6 years. But let me back up and explain that. Each conference, ours being the Northern California Nevada Conference, or the NCNC, chooses 12 delegates and 2 alternates. Each delegation must reflect the cultural, ethnic, gender, age groups, etc., of the memberships of our churches. And as I learned the first time I volunteered 6 years ago, older white women who have volunteered in the NCNC are not in short supply. I could not be a delegate. Members of the Golden Gate Association, which I serve on, encouraged me to attend as a guest, which meant I paid my own way, and I did. It was expensive, but I'm glad I went, and that I have this opportunity to share some of the experience with you. I'm grateful to both the Golden Gate Association and to this church for contributing $600 each, which paid for my hotel room and some meals. The Synod ended on Tuesday, but Monday was my final day. I started the day by attending a breakfast session at 6:30, sat through 2 business meetings before lunch and 1 afterwards, attended a wonderful dinner of PAM, the Pacific American Asian Ministries, where I don't qualify either, but you can be a friend of PAM, and I am. And that had speakers and a hukula lesson. And then I was reluctantly headed back for 1 more evening session of business. What I really wanted to do was to go back to my hotel and pack. But, you know, I'm a responsible person, and so I headed for the final plenary session. And as I entered the meeting hall, I saw Meredith Jackson just inside the doors. I told her of my dilemma. With a smile, she said, "Well, they're going to vote on a change in the bylaws." I went back and packed. Meanwhile, I had downloaded an Uber app on my phone, and I used it to return to the airport Tuesday morning for the trip home. If you'll remember the pictures on the back of that bulletin, a tremendous amount of business took place, but prayers, songs, and worship were a part of every single day, and the Spirit of God was present. Amen.